There's a reason some convent walls are thicker than others. Not for insulation, not for tradition, but to muffle what was never supposed to be heard. Breathing where no one should be breathing. Scratching that echoes without a source, and voices so faint they barely touch your ears, yet they linger in your thoughts for weeks. Welcome to Convent Nightmares. If you're brave enough to peer into the sealed corners of holy ground, subscribe now, leave a like, and tell us in the comments below, what city and country are you watching from? We want to know, so she knows where to find you when she returns. They say that in the old convent of Santa Lucia, built deep into the stone cliffs of northern Italy, there's a hallway where no doors open and no windows shine. The sisters call it the Passage of Echoes. But the echoes aren't just sounds. They're warnings. They carry the breath of something that should have died a long time ago. Something or someone forgotten, but never truly gone. Sister Agnes was a novice when she first heard the humming. It was a low, trembling melody hidden behind stone and sealed prayer. She asked the older nuns, and they told her it was the wind, always the wind. But wind doesn't whisper your name. Wind doesn't cry. Wind doesn't beg. And still she returned night after night, drawn to that cursed hallway like moth to flame. The song became clearer, more human, more desperate. Sometimes it was singing, sometimes it was praying, and sometimes it was screaming. The walls were thick for a reason, not to protect the outside world from sin, but to keep something sacred locked away, something alive, something hungry. Sister Agnes wasn't like the others. While the other novitiates obeyed with eyes lowered and hearts bound in scripture, she had questions. Too many, the older sisters would mutter. But she was devout in her own way, drawn not just to the rituals, but to the mystery buried beneath them. That's why the hallway obsessed her. The long, cold corridor behind the vestry that seemed to pulse when no one walked it, that breathed when no wind blew. Others avoided it, saying the light dimmed near its center. But Agnes would linger, alone, palms pressed to the stone, listening. It began with whispers, faint, almost imperceptible, but the more she returned, the clearer they became. At first it was like a hymn being sung behind several walls, muffled yet melodic. But soon the voice broke from melody into weeping, and then pleading, not for release, but for someone to remember her name. "Maria!" it cried once, so clearly that Agnes stepped back, heart thudding. She knew no Sister Maria in the convent, not in her time nor in the archives, but the name haunted her dreams.
One evening, after evening vespers, she slipped away. Candle in hand, she returned to the hallway, barefoot to silence her steps. She brought with her a rosary, not for protection, but for offering. She felt, deep in her bones, that something was listening, and that it didn't want prayers, it wanted to be found. That night, she pressed her ear against the coldest section of the wall. Her breath caught. The weeping had stopped. A breath, just one, long, rattling breath, exhaled from the stone. Then a knock, slow, hollow. She stumbled back, nearly dropping the candle, but something compelled her to return the next night, and the next. Every evening the knocks grew louder. 3 times, then 5, then 13, always 13. 1 for each year, she realized. She didn't know how she knew, but she felt it. 13 years of being forgotten. 13 years of being buried, alive. Agnes stopped eating. She grew pale, haunted. The Mother Superior noticed and warned her not to let curiosity become rebellion, but Agnes no longer listened to sermons. She listened to the wall. The voice inside began speaking clearly now, just past the point of understanding. The words were wrong, out of order, some ancient form of Latin or perhaps something older, darker. But one thing was clear, it was a prayer meant for no one. The hallway grew colder by the day. Candles wouldn't stay lit. Paint peeled from the corners, and the statue of the Virgin nearby began weeping wax. No one dared speak of it aloud, but the sisters started blessing themselves twice when they passed. Some crossed themselves backward by mistake. Others stopped going there entirely. One night, thunder shook the convent, rain lashed the stained glass windows, and in the dead of night, Agnes disappeared. They found her bed empty, her habit folded neatly, her rosary twisted into a knot. And down the hallway, where the wall met the corner, the stone was cracked, just slightly, as if something had pressed from the inside. The next day, the weeping began again, but it was different now, softer, younger, and the voice no longer cried, Maria. It whispered, Agnes. They tried to seal the hallway, brick and mortar, holy water and prayer, but each attempt was undone. Cracks reopened, voices returned. Sometimes the sisters found small, fresh handprints in the dust, too small to be adult, but not childlike either, as if someone had aged without ever seeing light. Mother Superior declared the hallway accursed, off-limits, forbidden, but that only deepened its pull, and late at night some swore they still heard a breath from the wall, a breath that matched their own, rhythm for rhythm, like an echo that wasn't theirs. No one ever spoke Agnes's name again, but in the walls she was far from silent.
Years passed. The hallway, sealed and condemned, became something more than just forbidden. It became sacred in a twisted way. New novices were warned never to speak near it, never to let their gaze linger on the cracked mortar, and never,
under any circumstance, to answer if someone called from the other side. Most obeyed, but Sister Lucille, young and wide-eyed, was drawn to it like a moth to a flame, the same way Agnes had once been. Lucille had arrived with a strange past. Her mother, a midwife known for whispering psalms in reverse, had sent her to the convent in the hopes of cleansing her bloodline. That's what she told the priest. But Lucille had never asked for cleansing. She was content with her silence, her shadows, and her deep affinity for places that others avoided. She found the hallway on her third day, standing in front of it for nearly 10 minutes before anyone noticed. The older sisters pulled her away. "Do not tempt what doesn't want freedom," Sister Magdalena warned. "Some walls are built to protect what's outside." But Lucille had already heard it. Soft tapping from deep inside. It wasn't urgent nor angry. It was rhythmic, patient, as though it knew she'd come. That night, Lucille couldn't sleep. The chapel bell rang at midnight, though no one had touched it. Candles in the prayer room flickered in unison, despite there being no draught. When she finally drifted into sleep, she dreamed of a woman with no mouth, her eyes hollow and endless. She stood beneath an altar, her hands pressed flat against cold stone, humming a tune that didn't belong to any hymn Lucille knew. By the end of the week, Lucille had begun hearing her name at odd times, not shouted, whispered, in corners, behind doors, beneath the floorboards. Once, while scrubbing the steps, she paused and turned, certain someone had said "Lucille" right into her ear. But there was no one there, just the air, thick and warm, like breath on skin. One evening, just after the final prayers, Lucille approached the forbidden hallway. Not out of rebellion, but out of something deeper, something she couldn't name, a compulsion. She knelt by the wall, pressing her hand to it. Nothing happened. But when she began to rise, she felt it, a warmth under her palm, a pulse, slow, steady, alive. She screamed. Sisters came running. They found her collapsed, hand still pressed to the wall, eyes wide with something more than fear. The Mother Superior dismissed it as a fainting spell. But Sister Magdalena saw the truth. She'd seen it before. She saw it in Agnes, the descent, the slow unraveling, and she feared it would happen again. In secret, Magdalena went to the archives. Buried beneath decades of records, she found a letter, not signed, not addressed, just a single page, yellowed and brittle. It read, "The wall does not keep her in, it keeps us out. She is not what she was when she went in. Do not feed her with memory." Magdalena returned to her cell, trembling. She had known that what lived in the wall was once human, but this implied transformation, corruption, not death, but mutation, something born from years of silence and stone, fed by prayers meant for other ears, something no longer Agnes, no longer Maria, no longer anything holy. Lucille was confined, for her own safety, they said, but every night the walls of her room pulsed with heat. Her dreams were no longer hers, and sometimes her breath would fog the glass of her window on the outside, as if someone stood there, watching from within the air itself. And then, one morning, she was gone. No one saw her leave. No doors were opened, no windows broken, but beneath her bed, etched into the floor, were the words, "She knows I remember." Beneath it, a single cracked stone, still warm.
The convent carried on, but it was not the same. There was a stillness in the corridors that even the creaking of old wood could not disturb. Sister Magdalena began to walk slower, not out of age, but as if afraid of disturbing something that now moved beneath the stone. Every prayer felt like a plea for ignorance, every silence a negotiation. They told the other novices that Lucille had returned home, but no carriage had arrived, no papers were signed. Her belongings remained untouched in her cell, except for one item. A rosary made of bone, laid neatly on her pillow, the crucifix turned backward. No one dared move it. At night, the bell rang again, always at 12:13, 13 minutes past midnight. It began softly, but night after night it grew louder, deeper, less like a bell, and more like something groaning through time. The sisters stopped looking at each other when it sounded. They no longer asked who heard it. Everyone did. Sister Magdalena started keeping vigil, sitting in the chapel with her candle, watching the shadows lengthen and twist. She read psalms aloud, but sometimes the verses came out wrong, reversed, as if her tongue had been borrowed. One evening, during the 5th verse of Psalm 91, she coughed up a stone, small, round, perfectly smooth, like it had never belonged in the earth. And then came the tapping, not from the hallway anymore, now from beneath the pews, behind the crucifix, inside the confessional booth. One sister, Sister Alma, swore she heard it in her chest like a second heartbeat. The tapping never came from the same place twice. It moved, it watched, it listened. On the eve of Lent, the Mother Superior collapsed during supper, her mouth filled with soil. No one saw where it came from. Her last words were a whisper. "She remembers too much." That night, no one slept. Candles lit themselves, doors unlocked and opened, slowly but to nothing. And in the main hall, a hymn was sung by a voice that belonged to no one living. The next morning, Sister Magdalena found a passage in the forbidden Psalter, a page bound in leather and salt, hidden inside the oldest Bible.
It spoke of the veiled one who was neither dead nor alive, fed by devotion, formed by stone, kept by promise. And below that, scribbled in rushed ink, she was never buried, she was sealed. There is a difference. Panic gripped Magdalena's breath. She understood now that Agnes, if it was still Agnes, had not been interred for punishment or death, but as containment, a sacrifice, a sealing. But the seal had been cracked. Lucille's touch, her thoughts, her remembering, it had fed the thing again. And now it was free to move, if only just. The sisters began to disappear. First, Sister Miriam, last seen walking into the garden, now overgrown with roots shaped like fingers. Then Sister Bethany, who screamed during prayer and vanished before her voice stopped echoing. Magdalena tried to hold them together, to call for help, but phones shattered when lifted, letters returned unopened, each envelope cold as bone. In desperation, she returned to the forbidden hallway. The stone was warm again, but now there were voices. Not one, many. Whispering names, sins, secrets. Some in Latin, some in tongues no one spoke, but all carried the same message. She is no longer patient.
Sister Magdalena no longer walked the convent in silence. She glided, as if her feet no longer trusted the ground. The stones betrayed her. They hummed, sighed, even trembled faintly beneath her steps. The air smelled wrong now. It wasn't incense or mildew. It was breath, hot, stale breath that pulsed through the corridors as if the entire convent had become lungs. The remaining sisters had changed too. Their eyes were dimmer, voices lower. They flinched at prayers and avoided mirrors. One nun, Sister Bernice, began speaking backwards, words pouring from her mouth as if yanked by strings from somewhere else. Another refused to sleep in her cell and instead knelt by the chapel wall, whispering, "I'm sorry," over and over. No one dared ask to whom. Magdalena kept returning to the old journal of Saint Valeria, the only saint buried beneath the convent's foundation, an ancient martyr whose body was never exhumed. The pages were brittle, but the ink bled fresh each time she opened it. One entry chilled her marrow. The girl they sealed behind the walls, she listens through stone and learns through silence. Every prayer spoken in doubt feeds her. Every sin left unconfessed strengthens her grip. That night, she heard a scream. It came from beneath the altar, ragged, human, but distant, like someone screaming into a jar buried miles deep. She rushed to the chapel, heart pounding, only to find Sister Bernice banging her head against the floor, eyes rolled back, blood pooling from her ears. Magdalena dragged her away and wept when Bernice rasped, "She asked what it feels like to breathe." She died before Magdalena could answer. The walls began to sweat. No one else noticed at first, but when Magdalena touched the bricks near the west wing, her fingers came away damp, sticky, like syrup. She tasted it out of instinct. Salt and iron, blood. The convent was bleeding. The walls were remembering.
And still the hymn came every night, that same wordless melody sung by that voice. Not a scream, not a song, something in between, a question unanswered for centuries. Sister Magdalena began scratching the floor of her cell at night, tracing sigils with a nail she tore from her own hand. She didn't know where the symbols came from, but they calmed the tapping, at least for a while. She marked her door, her bed, her Bible, and in a final act of defiance, she carved one into the wooden crucifix hanging by her pillow. That night, the hymn stopped, but the tapping returned, louder. They broke open the confessional the next morning. Inside was Sister Ruth, missing for 7 days, curled like a fetus and sewn shut at the lips. Not stitched, sewn. Her mouth held closed with thin gold thread. Her hands were folded in prayer, eyes wide open, tears like oil. Pinned to her chest was a note. She hears the lies you whisper into the dark. No one spoke for hours. Magdalena knew what had to be done. She returned to the sealed hallway, the original one, hidden behind a tapestry of the Assumption. She carried no light this time, only the bone rosary left on Lucille's bed. Her steps felt heavier with each echo. The stones no longer trembled. They pulsed like veins. She pressed her hand to the brick, whispered, "Forgive me," and felt it shift. The wall opened, not like a door, more like lips or a wound. And inside was not a room, but a narrow passage lined with candle stubs, hair, teeth, and bones arranged like rosary beads. The air was thick, screaming in silence, and at the end of it, eyes, open, awake, waiting.
Sister Magdalena should have run. Every part of her body told her to flee, to drop the rosary and seal the wall shut again. But she couldn't. The eyes were not just watching, they were pleading. The space inside the wall wasn't empty. It was occupied by something alive, though not in the way flesh is alive. It breathed through the silence. It remembered through darkness. The girl, the nun, she had never truly died. Magdalena stepped forward. The passage narrowed, forcing her to turn sideways. Her shoulders scraped along jagged stone and bone. The air vibrated, humming a low note that wasn't sound. It was memory. Whispers brushed against her ears, words from prayers long abandoned. Deliver us from what we've buried, from what we've become. At the end of the corridor, a small alcove opened. The walls were painted in blood. Handprints, symbols, faces etched with fingernails. In the center, curled on a bed of crumbling hymnals, was the girl. No older than 16, skin translucent, ribs visible, hair white as ash and tangled like roots. Her lips were stitched, but moved as if speaking. Her eyes locked on to Magdalena's, and she wept. But they weren't tears. They were ink. As the black fluid ran down her cheeks, Magdalena stepped closer, heart breaking. She reached out to wipe one away, and the girl gasped, not with air, but with light.
The alcove flickered like a dying candle, and Magdalena was overwhelmed with visions, not memories, confessions. Every sin whispered in the convent, every betrayal, every moment of doubt, they had all fed her. The girl had been made a vessel of guilt. She was the altar beneath the altar, the secret beneath the stone. The stitching on her lips snapped. Her voice spilled out not as words, but as a scream so quiet it shattered the walls from within. Cracks raced along the corridor. Bones split. The walls groaned and trembled. Magdalena dropped to her knees, holding the girl's face, whispering prayers she no longer believed. The girl's mouth moved again, forming one word. Why? Before her body disintegrated into ash. The corridor collapsed. Magdalena awoke beneath rubble, bruised, bleeding, but alive. She crawled through a gap in the stone, emerging back into the chapel. Everything was gone. The hymnals, the pews, the altar, all buried. And above it all, in the stained glass window, the face of the Virgin had changed. It no longer looked serene. It looked like the girl. She stumbled outside into the morning light, but the sun refused to rise. A gray haze had settled over the convent grounds. Birds flew in circles above the steeple, but never landed. The soil around the graveyard bubbled, as if exhaling. Magdalena fell to her knees in the garden and screamed, but no sound came out. Her voice had been taken, not stolen, sacrificed. The sisters never spoke of what happened. They sealed the chapel, they buried the confessional, they burned the journals. But Sister Magdalena was never the same. She wandered the halls with black ink trailing from her eyes, unable to pray, unable to sleep. And each night, at the 13th hour, the convent filled with humming, not a hymn, not a warning, just a question no one dared answer. Until one night, she vanished. No one saw her leave. No door was opened. Her cell was undisturbed. Only the crucifix above her bed was different, upside down, with the sigil she once carved glowing faintly beneath it. Some say she returned to the passage. Others say she became part of the stone. But every year, on the night of Saint Valeria's feast, the chapel door unlocks by itself, and inside the hymn returns, soft at first, then louder, sung by voices no one recognizes, in a language no one remembers. And if you look closely at the stained glass Virgin, you'll see her lips moving, asking, still asking, why? So if you ever find yourself in a forgotten town, with a chapel no one enters, and the bells ring without wind, and the walls seem to hum even when the world is silent, don't look too closely at the stained glass. Don't try to understand the shapes in the stone, or the way the shadows crawl toward the altar. And above all, don't listen when the voice begins to whisper in a language older than prayer. Because some things were never meant to be uncovered. Some sins are not forgiven. They are walled up, fed by silence, and kept alive by those too afraid to confess.
The girl beneath the altar didn't die. She was transformed, made into something sacred and horrifying. And Sister Magdalena, she didn't vanish. She was chosen. And now she waits for another voice, another soul brave enough or foolish enough to answer the question that still echoes through the stones. This has been another tale from Convent Nightmares. If your lights are still on and your breath steady, leave a like, subscribe for more stories that should have stayed buried, and comment below your city and country so she knows where to start looking. Some prayers were never meant for heaven, only for walls.